Okay, so we're online. So I'm about to start the vote.
I can hear music from you, Joe.
Oh, not again.
Okay.
Oh, damn it. I have that tab up. I see it. I think this is it. Yeah. Okay.
Okay, good. Thank you.
Yeah, that was Judge Napolitano starting. All right, you speak last. Sorry.
No, you're fine. I'll just testing, 1, 2, 3, making sure I'm last. One, two, three.
Oh,
Okay, I'm going to start the intro.
Okay, just give me the countdown when you're ready.
Already?
Getting ready. Need to speak last.
Get out your notebook. There's more.
oh, shit.
Shut up. 4, 3, 2.
Welcome to CNLive, Season 6, Episode 1, The ICJ Rules on Israel. I'm Elizabeth Voss in Fayetteville, Arkansas.
And I'm Joe Lauria, the editor-in-chief of Consortium News, reporting from The Hague in the Netherlands, where yesterday the International Court of Justice issued its interim ruling in the case of South Africa versus Israel. South Africa has accused Israel of committing genocide in Gaza and asked the court for provisional measures, including ordering Israel to halt its military operation while Israel is put on trial for genocide.
The court found that there was a dispute between South Africa and Israel and had jurisdiction in the case. Israel had argued that no formal dispute between the parties exists. The court also rejected Israel's argument to dismiss the case, ruling that there is prima facie evidence that Israel is committing the crime of genocide in contravention of the Genocide Convention. That means Israel will indeed be put on trial for genocide, a momentous decision that few people ever thought would be possible. Based on that preliminary finding, the court ordered the following provisional measures. Israel shall take all measures within its power to prevent all acts within the scope of the Genocide Convention, Article 2. And the first measure is that Israel must immediately ensure its military does not commit acts within the scope of Article 2. It must direct and punish all members of the public who engage in the incitement of genocide against Palestinians. It must ensure provision of urgently needed basic services like humanitarian aid. It must prevent the destruction of and ensure the preservation of evidence and allegations of acts of genocide. And Israel will submit a report as to how they're adhering to these orders to the ICJ within 1 month. From South Africa's point of view, and from those who want to see Israel's genocidal massacre stopped, these were positive orders.
However, it is a ruling that has engendered various interpretations, which we'll discuss today, some which might exaggerate what the court has actually ruled. For instance, the court did not order Israel to stop genocidal acts, as many people are saying. It said it must prevent genocidal acts that the court hasn't yet ruled are actually taking place. Calling on Israel to stop such acts would mean the court had already determined that genocide is occurring. The court requires Israel to follow its orders, including not to kill civilians, but only, quote, within the scope of Article 2 of the Genocide Convention, allowing perhaps Israeli lawyers to argue that Palestinian civilian deaths are occurring outside that scope. An army can kill civilians, even in a war crime, without committing genocide. Is the court just telling Israel that when killing civilians, please be careful not to violate Article 2 of the Genocide Convention, because we're going to try you on a charge of violating it? If that's the case, then the court's ruling doesn't seem radically different from what the United States has been telling Israel. Be careful how you defend yourself. In regard to that, international humanitarian law on the obligations of an occupying power are complex, on the question of when it can use force in self-defense. Certainly on Israeli territory, Israel has a right under Article 51 of the UN Charter to self-defense. But is it lawful to take offensive measures on a territory it occupies, on which it has an obligation, the Geneva Conventions, to care for the occupied people? Would the occupying Germans, for instance, have had the right to defend itself against attacks by the resistance on French territory? The court never discussed this issue at all. Some argued that an order for a ceasefire would have prejudged the case on the merits, which is to come, before the trial even begins. But could the court not have ordered Israel to suspend its military operation while the trial proceeds to determine if genocide is taking place? This would rob Israel of arguing its killing of civilians is outside the scope of the convention. There is a video of South Africans dancing in celebration of the court's decision. But the people who really count here are not the South Africans or anyone else, but the people of Gaza. And reporting from there indicates bitter disappointment by the people who were reported to be crushed by this ruling. Only a suspension of Israel's assault, it seems, would have served them.
Perhaps the world has gotten so used to Israel's ironclad impunity that a court saying Israel is plausibly committing genocide and should prevent their soldiers from doing so is such a shocking departure from the past that it is inviting celebration. Perhaps the most important question, though, is whether the court's order will alter Israel's behavior to substantially reduce civilian casualties and substantially increase humanitarian services. We should know in 1 month when Israel is supposed to report back to the court.
Politically, there are questions apart from the legal ones. And for example, how does this ruling change the decades-old impunity that the U.S. and Israel have enjoyed? Is it cracking? Is this part of it, the changing world order in which the U.S. has lost so much legitimacy in just the past 3 years, when you consider Afghanistan, Ukraine, and now Gaza? To discuss these questions and more, in what should be a lively discussion, we're joined by legal and geostrategic analyst Alexander Mercouris, who's in London, is the editor of the Duran, and in Raleigh, North Carolina, is Ray McGovern, a former CIA analyst and an activist. We hope to be joined a little later in the program by international law professor Francis Boyle from Illinois. Alexander, let me start with you, since you have the legal background here. Just some of the legal questions that I raised. I don't want to get bogged down in it. I do want to get onto the political issues, which I'm more adept at and more interested in. But what about some of these, the question I asked, for example, about whether they're limiting the scope to Article 2 of the convention, whether Israel can argue that the deaths that we're causing are outside that scope?
Yes, I mean, they can argue these things, and it's important to understand we are absolutely at the start of what I suspect is going to be a very long process of litigation indeed. Up to this point, the Israelis have not taken this case seriously. Their presentation, in my opinion, to the court in response to South Africa's was not at all strong, and it's worked against them. We've had this ruling from the court, a ruling which should not be underestimated, in my opinion. But yes, the Israelis can respond to these points. They can make the points that you've been making. The point is that in a litigation process, it is always open to the other side to make contrary points as well. And that is what we now have. Given that the court has now found that there is a prima facie case of genocide, the burden is now going to pass to Israel to show every time that civilians are attacked, every time that shelling takes place, every time that they do certain things. If the South Africans say this is consistent with a genocidal intention, it will be for the Israelis now to try and argue that this is not the case. So it is not decisive. We are at the start of a litigation process. The Israelis may come up with many arguments, but they are on the back foot.
Well, what about if after 1 month, when they submit their report, that the court is not satisfied that they're doing what they're being asked to do, that they're not preventing acts that are plausibly genocide. What could the court do at that point? Could they issue more orders? Could they just go to the Security Council to try to enforce it? Which, of course, we know the U.S. would veto any effort, even, obviously sanctions or economic sanctions, and even a military force is an option for the Security Council on the Chapter 7 to try to stop Israel. We know the U.S. is going to stop. So what happens if Israel gives a report and the court says this isn't good enough?
Well, this is you put your finger on it, because it is not in the power of the court to enforce these orders. The court has made orders. Some of these orders are mandatory. They have the weight of international law behind them. If Israel either simply disregards these orders, which, by the way, is what Israel is currently doing, and I think this is an important thing to say. I mean, they have essentially trashed this entire order. Incredibly arrogant and, in my opinion, foolish decision. But that's what they've done. If they continue in this course, or alternatively, if they do the sort of thing that, if I have to say it, bad lawyers tend to do, which is to try to string the court along by pretending compliance and then throwing in, equivocations and saying, we can't quite do this and we're trying to do that, but we're not really doing it because for the moment it's too difficult, that kind of thing. Then it seems to me that two things start to happen. Firstly, the court will probably make more orders. It might start to make more findings. It might start to make stronger findings against Israel, that Israel is being non-compliant. Eventually, bear in mind that this is a litigation process, which most people assume is going to last for years, perhaps decades. If Israel simply refuses to cooperate, the court might say, well, look, there is a huge amount of evidence coming from the South African side. Remember, the South African side is always in a position to submit evidence. There's a huge amount of evidence coming from the South African side. There is obstruction from the Israeli side. So maybe we are starting to say to ourselves, well, if there's obstruction, maybe the reason there's obstruction is because this case of this prima facie case of genocide is real after all. So, maybe we can start to move to some kind of, maybe not final judgment, but judgment that something like that is actually happening, and happening on an extensive scale. But in the meantime, the obvious thing for the court to do, if its orders are being disregarded, is to take it to the Security Council. The United States, as you rightly say, has veto powers on the Security Council. So does Britain, which I suspect, again, would probably go along with the United States. But what we have seen over the last couple of months, since the events that began in October, is that the Security Council, the United States and Britain have increasingly become isolated. A difficult position for them to be in at any time, especially now when one senses that the global situation is shifting. The General Assembly, there's been 2 votes in the General Assembly, each with big majorities. In the second vote, calling for a ceasefire, the majority was even bigger. And of course, it's possible that the General Assembly might start to do things. Now, the General Assembly generally doesn't do very much. Its resolutions are advisory. But about a year ago, the Western powers, including the United States and especially Britain, were, for example, suggesting that the General Assembly refer Russia to the International Criminal Court. Just one example. So they were saying that the General Assembly has the power to do that. There doesn't seem to be a provision to that effect in the Rome Statute, and it was abandoned. But in this situation, when the International Criminal Court has already said that it believes it has jurisdiction in this case, in relation to what is going on in Gaza, given that Palestine is a signatory to the Rome Statute. I mean, it's not inconceivable. I mean, I can imagine a situation where the General Assembly tells the International Criminal Court, look, the ICJ has ruled that there's a prima facie case. There is clear obstruction by Israel. They're not complying with the orders. There's an enormous amount of death and destruction and going on in Gaza all the time. This is the moment for you to act. And what does the ICC do if it gets that kind of referral from the General Assembly? So this is a complex game. I understand if you are living in Gaza and you're having the bombs falling on you and you're being cut off from food and supplies and you have Israeli soldiers in your streets and you have fighting going on, that this is frankly going to seem very weak and very limited, and you probably have no time and no patience for legal games and diplomatic moves in New York. But that's the reality, I'm afraid, of international politics. And in those terms, Israel has suffered a significant defeat. And this process is now going to move forward in ways which I think Israel is going to find it more difficult to suppress in the way that you said.
Oh, I have two other legal questions, but I'm going to hold them for later because I want to bring Ray McGovern in, who's in Raleigh, and we've just been joined by Craig Murray as well, I suppose, from Geneva. Ray, let's get away from the legal side for a second. And what is the impact politically of this decision? Forget about what I said in the introduction. Again, I raised a lot of legal questions, and I'm questioning whether or not the ceasefire was possible and all of that. What about this, the political impact? Did you ever think we'd see this? What does it change? What does it change?
What's the operative factor here, in my view, is that it's an election year. Biden has already lost a lot of support in some key Midwestern states and among people 2 generations younger than I. He's in deep kimchi, okay? Now, I assume, like most others, that the U.S. would veto a UN resolution, but I'm no longer so sure. There is a personal jeopardy element that's been introduced here. Genocide is genocide. Accomplices are accomplices, and people who enable genocide can be brought into the dock, okay? My view is that Biden, given his advanced age, I mean, he's almost as old as I am, for God's sake, he doesn't give a rat's patootie about being put in the dock. But you got these little guys, these little acolytes like Sullivan and Blinken and some other people, you know, they could have an effect on what happens here out of a feeling of self-preservation. How much do we hope to support the Israelis if this is going to redound on us personally? So I don't know what's going to happen, but I think that's a new element that's been introduced here. And of course, everyone knows, but it bears repeating, that without the United States, this could not continue. That's a big deal. And there are a lot of people in the United States that realize that now, and the court decision will galvanize those of us who are strongly opposed to what's going on. And it remains to be seen what's going to happen in 1 month. But lastly, I'll just say, you know, what about the children? And we could talk about the legal niceties, but I would prefer Roger Waters so that no one kills the children anymore.
Well, Ray, there was a hearing in California yesterday on the case brought by the Center for Constitutional Rights in New York, charging Biden, Blinken, and Austin. I don't think Sullivan was in there. He might be, with complicity for genocide. And they had a court hearing. So that's the domestic issue there, as you say, that's really going to damage Biden. So does that make him change his policy? Is he going to cut? I mean, any politician is going to cut whoever's been helping them if it's going to mean helping them survive. And right now, Israel may be sinking Biden. What will he do?
I don't know, but I will say that he has this passionate attachment to the Zionist state of Israel. And you don't have to, well, I'll just remind you what George Washington, our first president, said about the evil aspects of passionate attachments to countries that don't share the objectives that the United States of America should share. So, I don't know if he's able to change his mind. As I say, he's a very old guy. But I think his immediate advisors have a new element that they're worried about here. Not only the election, but also the notion that if this thing drags on, even if it's only 2, 3, 4 years from now, they could be put in the dock. I'm not saying they will dangle from a rope, but just being afraid of being put in the dock could change their mind. And to the degree they have any influence on Biden, that might play into this. I don't know, but it's a new element.
What you just said answered my first question, which was what has changed? Because the idea of an American president, I'm not talking about Donald Trump in a courtroom in New York for some civil case. I'm talking about an American president actually going on trial for the huge crimes that most American presidents since the Second World War have committed, which is absolutely unfathomable to think that that could ever happen. So this preliminary ruling that it's plausible that Israel is committing genocide changes the political environment that you could even imagine an American leader maybe being in the dock. Is that what you're saying, Ray McGovern?
Well, that's what you're saying, Joe. I'm more skeptical.
You agree?
The lawyers could play this thing out. It'll be referred and it will be, appealed and all this stuff. And I don't know whether it's possible for this to come to any kind of conclusion before the election. Perhaps it will, but I'm from Missouri on that one.
Yeah. Well, I mean, down the road, is it no longer sacrosanct, this idea? So one last question before we move to Craig. The legitimacy of the United States. Suppose they veto, it goes to the Security Council, okay? And I think any country, South Africa could bring it, or any country on the council right now, and then they want some kind of enforcement against Israel, sanctions, let's say, or at least just an original statement of condemnation by the council. And the U.S. vetoes that. What does that do to the waning and weakening legitimacy of the United States, given from Afghanistan debacle to Ukraine's debacle, and now their involvement here? What would that do? Because that would have to be part of the political equation if they decide vetoing this could hurt me politically at home, domestically, and internationally.
Joe, there's something called the Israel lobby.
Never heard of it.
This, in my view, this would help Joe Biden, for God's sake. He needs money. He needs powerful people behind him. You and I look at it from a justice point of view. Biden doesn't look at it that way, and neither do the Democrats, frankly. They're in it to win the election. And if this cuts the other way, that as the one you suggest, I think they would go ahead and veto it and take the international opprobrium. But that opprobrium is already built, and this is a big deal. It adds to it, but that's my calculation on their political calculations.
Right. So Israel's not becoming a liability. Elizabeth, maybe you'd like to take over and ask Craig some questions.
Sure. Yeah, Craig, I was following your coverage of the proceedings from The Hague with, a lot of attention, close attention. And I noticed that in your reporting from the courtroom, you said that some of the judges were basically fiddling with iPads during some of South Africa's presentation to the court. And so I was wondering what you expected the ruling to look like based on your experience in the courtroom. And were you surprised at all by what we heard yesterday? You're muted.
I wasn't surprised by the order of provisional measures and the way that the provisional measures were slightly fudged. That's what I expected. I was surprised by the strength of the statement before that. In ruling that there were plausible grounds for genocide, it was not necessary for the president of the court to go into so much detail as to what the plausible grounds for genocide were that they had found. It was not necessary for the president of the court to read out 4 different quotes from Israeli ministers, including from the president of Israel, detailing incitement to genocide. It wasn't necessary for the president of the court to read out 3 or 4 statements by senior officials of the United Nations detailing the horrific death and destruction in Gaza. And also the court, while saying they couldn't be verified, gave the Hamas, as the BBC would say, the Hamas-run Ministry of Health's figures for deaths, and the court gave those and relied on them. So it was impossible really to listen to that and think not only is the court minded that there is a plausible case for genocide, the court is minded there's a pretty strong case for genocide, and that surprised me. That, in a sense, doesn't feed into the orders, because there's a great deal of consternation as to why a ceasefire wasn't ordered, why the word ceasefire wasn't used, and obviously that political, and whether the first part of the order amounts to calling for a ceasefire, because you would need effectively almost a ceasefire in order to implement it. I would argue, purely as a bit of analysis, that actually it doesn't rule out continuing genuine, what you might call anti-terrorist operations of a very limited kind, which avoid civilian casualties. Those, you could do that and argue you were complying with the order. But in a sense, it's tautologous, because the first part of the order is an instruction to obey the Genocide Convention in terms. It's saying you are accused of breach of Article 2, A, B, C, and D, and we order you to comply with Article 2, A, B, C, and D. Well, legally, that makes no difference to anything on the grounds that as a country which has ratified the treaty, Israel was already obliged to keep Articles 2, A, B, C, and D, whether the court told them to or not. So, in a sense, that doesn't actually add anything. But why it does add something is that it was very, very plain from all that preceding explanation that the court believes this is a genocide. And that's where I think I think it's important people, and I'm sorry, I'm going beyond your question, and I will shut up in a minute, but I think it's important people understand that this is the start of a process, not the end of a process. I mean, that's true in the legal sense, and this was an interim ruling on whether a case is going to proceed, and the case will eventually proceed. It's also true in a political sense. This is just the beginning of this. And the truth is, bluntly, that if the court had actually ordered a ceasefire, that would make no difference on the ground in Gaza at all anyway. Israel would not have complied if the court had ordered a ceasefire, just as Israel has no intention of complying with the actual order that Israel must keep to A, B, C, and D of the Genocide Convention. The ability of Western powers to portray, to put out an entirely false narrative and essentially claim wildly that Israel actually won yesterday, when the decision was quite obviously humiliating for Israel. Their arguments were dismissed in their entirety. Is slightly scary, because if enough people believe that the International Court of Justice has said Israel is fine and doing the right things and there is no genocide, then obviously the political pressure doesn't come to bear. But that's a different question. Anyway, I think that's enough on the first question.
Yes, and it was interesting too that you see this in the media, this representation of Israel having sort of won, but yet in Israel, Israeli officials are very angrily calling the ICJ anti-Semitic. So it's a bit of a divide there. Alexander, I wanted to ask you really quickly, what could the ICJ have done if they had completely agreed that that a genocide is taking place, that we must stop it? What could the public have seen, in the most pro-Palestine outcome possible?
I don't personally think that they could have come to a decision after a 2-day hearing that a final order. I think had they done that, Israel and the Western powers would have come back and said the court has clearly prejudged this thing. They're not acting properly. There has to be a litigation process. I don't think that was ever going to happen. I'm going to say straight away, I think the court was extremely nervous about this case. I don't think the judges who were trying it were happy to be trying a case like this against a country like Israel. But they had been presented with overwhelming evidence, massive, disproportionate use of force by Israel in Gaza, indiscriminate use of force, killing tens of thousands of people, and exactly what Craig was talking about just now, these incredible, appalling statements, one after the other, by Israeli officials, which clearly appear to show a genocidal intent, and which continued, by the way, incredibly, even as the proceedings were underway. I mean, this is what was, it must have been shocking. So they eventually decided that they had no choice, and that's how I see this, than to say, look, there is clearly here a plausible, very strong case, as Craig has said, and they went into the detail why that is so. And that's why they gave the orders that they did, the interim orders that they did. We should not overlook the fact, as I said, that they did say there is a plausible case and that interim orders, therefore, to prevent a possible genocide, well, not possible, a genocide that might be happening, were needed. And Craig, of course, is absolutely correct when he says that Israel is obliged not to carry out a genocide anyway, as a matter of international law, and it is tautologous in simple language to order Israel not to do that which it is obliged anyway not to do. But of course, tautology is exactly what lawyers do all the time. It is entirely normal in courts. What the court is now telling Israel is, look, you're now on notice. We can see what you appear to be doing. We can hear what you are saying. If you continue in this way, you are going to be in very, very deep trouble indeed. That is what the court has said.
Francis Boyle is joining us from Illinois. Francis, thanks for coming on. You were quoted. Can you hear me?
Yes,
can
I
we
can.
hear you? Okay, excellent. So you were quoted by the Institute for Public Accuracy as saying this is a massive, overwhelming legal victory for the Republic of South Africa against Israel on behalf of the Palestinians. The UN General Assembly now can suspend Israel from participation in its activities as it did for South Africa and Yugoslavia. It can admit Palestine as a full member. And especially since the International Criminal Court has been a farce, it can establish a tribunal to prosecute the highest level officials of the Israeli government, both civilian and military. That's a lot there, Francis, that you got out of this ruling. Can you explain how all of that is possible from this preliminary ruling?
Well, thanks for having me on, Joe, and my best to all my friends at Consortium. Let me start by saying I was the first lawyer ever to win anything from the World Court on the Genocide Convention. That was on behalf of my clients, the Republic of Bosnia-Herzegovina against Yugoslavia on 8 April 1993. And it was a massive, overwhelming order in favor of the Bosnians. And then I won a second World Court order for the Bosnians on 13 September 1993 against Yugoslavia. And that was massive and overwhelming in favor of the Bosnians. This was the first time ever that any lawyer or government had won two orders in one case at the World Court since it was founded in 1921. And then I want a third order from the president of the court exercising the powers of the court under the rules of the statute of the International Court of Justice, 74, paragraph 4. So based on my knowledge, judgment, and experience before the order came down, you will see if you do a Google search, I had predicted correctly so that South Africa would win a request for provisional measures of protection on behalf of the Palestinians along the lines of the first measure of protection I won for the Bosnians, and that was unanimous. And if you have a look at their first order, 15-2, not unanimous, but the Israeli judge at Hague Barak and the Ugandan judge, I haven't had a chance to read his opinion, 15-2, that's higher than I predicted. I thought there'd be some political play in it, but 15-2. And basically that Israel, as I predicted, must cease and desist from committing all acts of genocide against the Palestinians. If you read it, it's very clear exactly what it says and what I predicted. Now, we come here to the controversial part. 15-2, the state of Israel shall ensure with immediate effect that its military does not commit any acts described in point 1 above, the cease and desist on all acts of genocide. Now, you have to understand that, first of all, I was Bosnia's ambassador to the World Court for almost a year and spent 4 full days arguing before the court to get those orders. They are highly technical and positivistic. So Hamas was not a party to this litigation. So there was no way they could issue an order to Hamas for a ceasefire. It could not happen. They could issue a ceasefire against Israel, but that would be completely imbalanced. So what they did here was the next best thing. They could issue this order against the Israeli military, saying that you have to cease and desist from committing all acts of genocide against the Palestinians set forth in Article 1 of that Provisional Measures of Protection. That's exactly what they did. They went as far as they could. I commend them for saying this. This is not like the case Ukraine v. Russia, where both states were parties to that litigation and they could call for a ceasefire. Now, I won't go through the rest of the order here, but if you look at the votes, 15-2, 16-1, unanimous, it's a smashing legal victory. Now, what happens? Under the terms of the United Nations Charter, the order goes to the Security Council for enforcement. You win an order from your local judge, the defendant doesn't obey it, so you have to go to the sheriff to get it enforced. That's the Security Council. Algeria has asked for a meeting of the Security Council on Wednesday to enforce this order. I guess we'll have to see what happens Wednesday. As of now, it does appear that the Biden administration, the Sunak government, will veto any enforcement at all. Very similar to what happened in the Nicaragua case, where my teacher, mentor, and friend Abe Chase won an order for the Nicaraguans, took it to the World Court, and the U.S. vetoed it under Reagan. But that is not the end of the matter, because it can then be turned over to the United Nations General Assembly under the Uniting for Peace resolution. And under the Uniting for Peace resolution, there could be dramatic consequences for Israel. First, as you correctly pointed out, the General Assembly could suspend Israel from participation in its activities, like they did to the criminal apartheid regime in South Africa, and like they did to my adversary, the genocidal Yugoslavia. Second, the General Assembly, pursuant to its powers under Article 22 of the UN Charter, can set up an international criminal tribunal for Israel. I started an initiative to that effect in the General Assembly several years ago. It was pioneered by Malaysia and Iran. I lined them both up and supported by a large number of Arab Muslim states in the General Assembly. It was sabotaged by the usual suspect. But with this order, it might be that the General Assembly will revisit my proposal, set that tribunal up, and start prosecuting the highest level officials of the both civilian and military in Israel. Third, the General Assembly can recommend UN member states adopt sanctions, serious sanctions against Israel. As you know, Joe, today North Korea suffers under terrible draconian sanctions. Not that I support them today, but all those sanctions go back to a resolution by the UN General Assembly under the Uniting for Peace resolution. That's where they all go back to. They couldn't get it from the Security Council because of a Soviet veto. Next, the General Assembly could recommend that all UN member states sever diplomatic relations with Israel. Finally, under the Uniting for Peace resolution, the General Assembly can admit Palestine as a full-fledged UN member state. Now, you've covered this, Joe. As you know, I did all the legal work for the Palestinians on this. They did try in 2012 to get full-fledged UN membership. The United States government opposed that, stopped them. So they settled for observer state status along the lines that Switzerland had before it became a full-fledged UN member state.
Right.
Well, the votes are there, and they could be admitted.
Craig, I want to ask you if you can answer this. It's a legal question, but the question of self-defense. Article 51 of the UN Charter, of course, allows a state to defend itself if it's attacked on its own territory. Israel was attacked on its own territory and it defended itself, and nobody questions that. But can an occupying power go into the occupying territory and engage in offensive military operations against the people that the Geneva Convention says they are obliged to protect their welfare? How does this work here? The question of self-defense.
Craig, you muted.
Hello?
Sorry.
Yeah.
I think I got it. Yep. I was actually just looking up Article 22 of the UN Charter, which, and I'll answer your question in a minute, but we maybe come back to that because it's about setting up subsidiary organs of the General Assembly. I'm not sure you can set up a tribunal over it, or that's been done. But Francis, can you hold that thought and I'll come back to you on it when I finish the first bit. I mean, one interesting point is I mean to go back over the ICJ judgment. Maybe Alexander knows. Given that Israel's defense at the ICJ at the hearings was based entirely on the right to self-defense, it's fascinating that the court hardly mentioned that at all. In fact, I'm not sure they did mention it. I'm not sure the phrase self-defense appears in the judgment, and that's something I want to go back and check. I certainly can't recall her talking of Israel's right to self-defense as a factor, and that really in itself is an astonishing thing, because they've virtually treated with contempt the Israeli defense, because of course, whether or not you have a right of self-defense, that is not a right to commit genocide, which is a totally different thing. The question of self-defense in the it appears to be established international law, and it makes sense that an occupying power has no right of self-defense in the territories which it illegally occupies. That makes entire sense. Where you have a hybrid situation where the people of an illegally occupied territory undertake attacks in the metropolitan of the power which is occupying them, and then you have a response into the occupied territory. That is a question on which I would say there probably is no. I very much doubt there is any judgment of the ICJ that actually tells you the answer to your question. And I think it's a question on which different people would have different opinions, and the question that perhaps needs to be settled, but I don't think it is a settled question. I think if Israel had carried out the kind of normal small scale, well, I say small scale, killing hundreds of people, but the normal, much smaller strikes into Gaza as a result of the action on 7 October, we wouldn't be here now, and probably there wouldn't be serious questioning. No one would have gone to the ICJ about whether or not Israel had the right to do that. Although the entire question of Israel's occupation position as an occupying power is up again before the ICJ on the February of 19th in a pre-existing case, which may give us the answer. But I'm sorry, that's a long way of saying I just don't know. I don't know where.
Well,
I don't know where the law would lie. I'm not sure anybody does definitively.
Joe, there
Francis.
is an answer. There is an answer to the question. If you let me have a second here, in the World Court advisory opinion on Israel's apartheid wall, the court did consider this matter self-defense. Now, Israel did not show up to argue there. It allowed its surrogates to make its arguments for it. Well, okay, a foreign sovereign cannot be forced to litigate before the World Court. But the court considered self-defense, and it rejected self-defense on the ground. Excuse me, if I could finish. On the ground that Israel is the belligerent occupant of the West Bank, and that a belligerent occupant does not have a right of self-defense under international law or UN Charter Article 51 with respect to the people it occupies. Rather, it is governed by the 4 Geneva Conventions and the Hague Regulations of 1907. Now, the reason why, now, as Craig correctly pointed out, Israel made the argument of self-defense. The court did not address it because the court, as I found out in the Bosnia case, the two orders I won for Bosnia, where I argued self-defense for Bosnia, in both orders, the court took the position that self-defense does not fall within the purview of the Genocide Convention. And so, therefore, I could not get a ruling from the court on Article 51 within the jurisdiction I had that was solely limited to the Genocide Convention. So I believe that is why, following what happened to me in the Bosnia case, the court said nothing at all about self-defense. But the argument has already been rejected. The Israelis' lawyers must have known that when they made this argument in court.
Yeah, in fact, the British barrister for South Africa raised the very question of the barrier and that judgment of the ICJ.
Right.
I recall now. You can't bond the territory.
Can I come back on that though? Because I mean, I'd love it to be the case. And my heart is with you, not. But I think in it's one sentence in that judgment on the wall. It's a single sentence, and it's almost an aside to the main argument. And The judgment doesn't depend on that on that sentence, and it doesn't deal with the question that was asked. It doesn't deal with the question of if people from an occupied territory attack into the metropolitan of the of the power that is occupying them, does the power attacked in its metropolitan have a right of self-defense? Is a different question, bluntly, and the answer may be the same. It may be comprehensive, but I don't think it is the same question, and I don't think we know what the World Court would rule on that. But and it's interesting because they could have said here, they could actually have said here, they could have said, no, we rejected the arguments of self-defense because this is an occupying power and it has no right of self-defense. This was a perfect opportunity to say that if that's what the law is, and they didn't say it, and I think they ducked the question because I think it's far too difficult a question. That's my view of it.
If I can just throw in, I think the whole self-defense argument that Israel made was an extraordinarily weak argument, which the court was bound to reject. I mean, what Israel needed to do was to go before the court and say, look, you've been told that we're committing a genocide in Gaza. The facts show otherwise. We're not committing a genocide in Gaza. Our actions in Gaza are proportionate and limited. We're not targeting civilians or trying to target civilians. We're not seeking to displace populations and that kind of thing. But of course, they were not in a position to do that because on the facts, it does appear, and that seems to me to be where the court is heading, that the use of force is disproportionate and it is combined with all these genocidal statements, or at least statements that appear to show genocidal intent from Israeli officials that the South Africans so carefully set out in their original submission. So I think that, again, just to say, I think that was a weak defense that Israel put together, and in some ways an arrogant one. And I think that if the Israelis had been a lot more disciplined in the way that they've been talking about the situation in Gaza since the events of October, if none of these statements had been made, it would have been much more difficult to get this decision and these orders. But they made these statements. They made them repeatedly. The Prime Minister of Israel, the former President of Israel, all sorts of officials in Israel made these statements. And I think that persuaded the court that there is a strongly plausible case. And that's why we are where we are.
Ray, do you want to weigh in on this, or I'll ask another question of you? It appears, I'm calling this bombing of Gaza urban renewal, to clear out that entire infrastructure so that it can be rebuilt and they can create a club med for Israelis to live along the Mediterranean. In other words, before you can populate Gaza and kick the Palestinians out, which appears to have been and still appears to be the goal here, they would have to destroy all the buildings and then rebuild them. How does this ICJ ruling affect those long-term plans? Does it gum up the works, or is Israel totally impervious to what the court is saying, what public opinion is saying, and what some media outlets are starting to say?
Well, it's chutzpah on steroids. The right word is impervious, okay? But there's another element that is seldom mentioned. Yeah, there are the beaches, nice beaches in Gaza. I've seen them, okay? But there are also natural gas deposits offshore in territorial waters. Whose territorial waters? Wow. Well, I don't have to take it any further there. The Greeks, people in Crete, and the Israelis are already negotiating on how they're going to get that into a pipeline to get some of that gas into Western Europe so that the Nord Stream 2 and 1, there'll be less necessary. You know, in other words, there's an economic aspect to this that plays a huge role in Israel's attitude as to who governs Gaza. that needs to be brought to the fore, I think. The other thing I'll just add is simply what Craig mentioned, public opinion, political pressure. That requires knowledge. That requires awareness. The Western populaces need to know what's going on. And a harbinger today was the Economist of London saying, "Oh, this is a terrible decision. It taints Israel for years because it will take years to come to a verdict on this thing. The net effect is Israel is tainted unnecessarily." Well, now we know what the Economist is, but if the Western press takes this line, people are so ill-educated that the political pressure, as Craig has already said, will be real hard to gather and to amass and to have any good effect.
Anyone could jump in, or Elizabeth, if you have some more questions. We're coming close
Sure,
to the end of the hour.
I'd like to get anyone's opinion on what this ruling says about the West's and so-called rules-based order, and it's just total support of Israel no matter what they do, especially in light of Israeli officials' response to the ruling being so defiant and brazen, and as Alex mentioned, all these really overt statements of genocidal intent that they made prior to the ruling. Yeah, so just your opinions on how much this embarrasses the West.
Well, I think that I don't know how embarrassed they feel. I think some officials in the West are acutely embarrassed, but the credibility of this rules-based international order that they've been talking about now for several years, which they've never properly defined, I think its credibility is shattered. I don't think that it was in particularly good health already, its credibility, before this ruling took place. But I think that, what has happened has shattered it even further. This is my own view. And I mean, now Israel has been, found, it's been prosecuted. It's been, have a case against prosecutors to Israel. It's got a case against it for genocide. We've heard all the things that the General Assembly might do, which go beyond, by the way, what I imagine that the General Assembly could do. But there we go. And I mean, I can't really see how credibly they can come back from this. Of course, they will try.
Can I come in? I think we will. We all have to do everything we can, of course, to increase the political pressure, and there will be warnings. I mean, I know for certain within the Foreign Office there'll be a memo. It might have come out yesterday, but there'll be something from Foreign Office legal advisors to ministers which will warn them in terms that things like continuing arms shipments may put them at risk of, it won't say definitely, but at risk of eventual personal prosecution for complicity in genocide, should genocide be found eventually. And I do think, as Ray said, these are people who are very selfishly motivated, and personal risk, I think, will make a difference. We're seeing defiance at the moment. The Foreign Office put out a statement today in the UK, which went as close to repudiating the International Court of Justice as it went closer to repudiating the ICJ than I ever thought I would see a British government do in public. And at the moment, the initial reaction is defiance. I think this attack on the on UNRWA is obviously part of that defiance. But this is going to play out over years. I mean, my own view is, from looking at the court both yesterday, that eventually, in 2 or 3 years' time, Israel is going to be found guilty of genocide. And that's when this really starts to play out, because at that stage, they can't keep pretending that Israel won in court yesterday. They control the media, so they can plug that narrative like crazy to the population, which is what they're doing now. But I think eventually this is going to be found to be genocide, and I know it's of no it's of no assistance today to the people dying in Palestine to say that, but I do think when that happens, that's going to be a shattering moment for the entire Western political elite. In effect, I think that's going to be seismic. And at the moment, they're thinking, oh, well, that's a couple of years away. It doesn't matter. But they're going to have to concentrate their minds on that more and more as every month goes past.
Having said that, I want to throw this question out. If you put yourself in the position of the Israeli lawyers right now, would they be telling the government, look, let's substantially decrease the number of civilian deaths in the next month? Let's increase the aid somewhat near the level that we lied about during our submissions on the 12th of January. Let's just, when the teacher's coming around, you behave well. And we'll let this thing will pass over. You think that's what we might likely see? Will there be at least a practical benefit for the next month in an ameliorated situation for Palestinian civilians because of this ruling?
Well, I'll answer. Please
I was
go
going
ahead.
to say that this order is hard power. Let me give you 2 examples from my own practice of law. After I won that first order for the Bosnians, I walked out into the foyer in front of the grand courtroom. The whole world news media was there. And I held the order up and I said, the World Court has determined genocide is going on here. Every party to the Genocide Convention has an obligation to stop it under Article 1, quote, to prevent genocide. And I am here calling for direct military intervention by the United States and the NATO states to save the Bosnians from extermination by the Yugoslavs. A few hours later, both Washington, D.C. and NATO headquarters in New York announced that they were going to institute a no-fly zone over Bosnia, that NATO jet fighters would shoot down any Serb jet fighters, planes, and helicopters. So they could no longer murder the Bosnians from the sky. Second, Libya in the Lockerbie bombing cases. George Bush Sr. had mobilized the Sixth Fleet off the coast of Tripoli on war maneuvers. They were penetrating Libyan airspace. I convinced Colonel Gaddafi to give me the authority to sue the US and the UK at the International Court of Justice, demand an emergency hearing and an indication of provisional measures of protection. I filed that lawsuit and those papers. I drafted them all myself. Bush Sr. ordered the Sixth Fleet to stand down. Let me repeat that. The mere filing of a World Court lawsuit and request for provisional measures of protection forced Bush Sr. to order the entire Sixth Fleet to stand down. No one was killed as a result of this. So this is hard power we're dealing with. Precisely how it will turn out, it's hard to say, but there will be consequences here. Yes.
Alexander, you were going to say something?
No, I mean that was very interesting. But can I say you specifically asked what are Israel's lawyers going to be advising? I mean, one would love to be a fly on the wall, but in a sense, I don't think it matters because I get the sense that the political leaders in Israel are just going to have already made a decision, which is that they're going to go on and doing exactly what they have been doing and they are convinced that politically their support amongst the Western powers, with United States, Britain, and Germany, which in my opinion very, very foolishly became involved in this case as a third party. I don't understand that, by the way. I don't understand the procedure of that. And if that can be explained, I'd be quite grateful. But anyway, they're convinced that it will, they'll continue to get that protection, which will, of course, all that will do is cause more and more embarrassment and more problems for their allies. And at the same time, it will cause tensions with those allies, which will be exacerbated, and it will probably cause tensions with Israel itself. But I don't think the Israelis are in any mind or mood to listen to legal advice. I think at the moment they've shown that they just don't care about it. That's my own feeling.
I also, there's one thing I want to say about the Israeli lawyers. I mean, when I sat in the court on the second day, and this is something Francis must have experienced as well, I was really shaken by some of the things Israeli lawyers were saying, the lawyers for the Israeli side, and that's because their legal teams were saying things which they must have known not to be true. They were saying, for example, that the widespread destruction to homes and civilian infrastructure in Gaza was largely due to Hamas, who had booby-trapped houses, and over 2,000 misfired Hamas missiles were responsible for a lot of the infrastructure destruction. They said that there was more food entering Gaza per day now than did before the 7th of October. They said that the reason for the large number of child deaths was that Hamas was employing child soldiers. That they were saying things that they must have known as a matter of fact to be untrue. So I don't think Israel, certainly in terms of a legal team that were taking the case to the court, I don't think Israel has a responsible legal team. They have a legal team which is happy to fuel the fantasies and repeat the fantasies of its leadership. You expect to hear arguments on the right of self-defense and that kind of thing, and there's no reason why everybody deserves a defense, and there's no reason why self-respecting lawyers shouldn't put arguments for either side, which are reasonable. But to be there when lie after lie after lie, big lies, were being told, you really did feel, I felt in the presence of evil. It felt horrible to be there and listen to it, and that was my biggest takeaway, in a sense, from the court. In that, as far as I understand it, in the legal profession, and some of these people were KCs. Lawyers are not meant to tell outright lies that they know to be lies in court. So I find that absolutely extraordinary.
Well, in response, Craig, let me say this. You're right. Ever since I entered Harvard Law School in September 1971, ardently supporting the Palestinians, I have debated Zionist lawyers at Harvard and all over the world. They all lie all the time. That includes Dershowitz, Dinstein, Gene Rostow, etc. They just lie. It's that simple. And that is why my experience in my debates with all these lawyers since I entered Harvard Law School, I usually win the argument. Indeed, I win because the Palestinians have truth and justice on their side. And that, I think, is why the South African lawyers won this argument. But they lie. It's that simple. They all lie. They never tell the truth. So I wasn't surprised.
Can I, Francis, I'd like to ask Francis, given all of the things that have just been adduced, and given the need to stop the killing, particularly of children, let's say the Security Council deals with this on Wednesday, and let's say, as most people expect, the resolution is vetoed, and let's say the General Assembly can get into the act and do the kinds of things that you are educating me to believe that they can do. How quickly? I mean, people are being killed every day. Will there be any Palestinians left in Gaza in 4 weeks? Francis, how quickly could this all happen if people faced up to the fact that we're dealing with genocide now?
Well, Ray, I had to deal with this with the Bosnians myself while I was arguing for them at the World Court and all these peace negotiations. I could watch them on CNN be exterminated live. It's a very difficult situation to see your clients get wiped out. But this is what we have. I do not advise the government of South Africa, but I do advise the Palestinians. The Palestinians are fully aware of all these options that they can pursue at the United Nations General Assembly. Obviously, this is South Africa's order. They will have to coordinate with South Africa, as we saw in the press conference afterwards. The South African foreign minister then had a high-level official from the Palestinians. I'm sure they are coordinating. So I don't know, Ray. I really can't say. But yeah, I watched my own clients get exterminated while I was doing the best I could to save them as a lawyer. It's a very tough situation, yes. Fortunately, I don't have legal responsibility for the Palestinians. I advise their leadership, but they do what they're going to do.
Can I make one very quick point, which is that if the sort of things that Francis, which I'm sure they will, we start getting indictments, for example, from tribunals, we start getting decisions that Palestine be made a full member state of the United Nations, which I think is very likely, by the way. I think there is a groundswell for this. If all of this starts to happen, if all of these events start to happen, one has to assume that the point is going to come when even the most powerful governments in the West start to say enough is enough. We are going far out on a limb now on behalf of Israel, and the Israelis aren't listening to what we're saying. And the time has therefore come to start reining Israel in, because there comes a point where whatever emotional links, feelings you have about Israel, however passionate they are, it becomes, for you, Israel becomes, so your support for Israel becomes a major problem. And the United States has a lot more to worry about in the world than just Israel. It's got to think about Russia, it's got to think about China, it's got to think about all kinds of things in all sorts of places. So I think that if we start to see things happening in the way that's been said by Francis and by Craig, then I think the pressure will become overwhelming and we will start to see a shift. And in Europe, I think we're already seeing it. Josep Borrell has had a very difficult meeting with the Israeli foreign minister, for example, very recently. And I think that more European governments will start to peel away. And the US and Britain and the others will feel increasingly isolated.
If I may, I hope you're right, Alexander. I think it's important not to believe that states act in the best interest of that state and its population at all times, as opposed to in the best interests of a particular politician who has his hands on the lever. And an awful lot of politicians are highly dependent on funding from the Zionist lobby. That's simply true, and are deeply, deeply compromised by that for 4 years, and maybe compromised in other ways too. It's been, we've already seen, certainly to use a UK example, we've seen the leader of the opposition, who's meant to be a famous human rights KC, refused to say whether it was a crime for Israel to shoot dead a man, an unarmed civilian holding a white flag. And he said, oh, well, I can't, how can I possibly judge? We've seen politicians absolutely humiliate themselves and take ludicrous positions in defense of Israel. And I think that road stretches a long way. I think these people don't suffer either shame or conscience in the way that normal people suffer shame and conscience. So I'm sorry, I'm not pessimistic. I think this is going to go very well. And I think this judgment, this interim ruling, is part of a process that is going to end with big improvements. I just maybe think it's going to take slightly longer to play out than others think.
I take the point.
Our online audience is asking what the chances are of this situation triggering World War III. I didn't know if any of you had a comment on that.
Sure, it's already. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No, please, Francis.
It's already spiraling out of control. As we can see, the government of Yemen has publicly announced that it is attacking ships there in the Red Sea on the approach to the Suez Canal in defense of the Palestinians, and they invoked Article 1 of the Genocide Convention. U.S. and U.K. have now, had 9 different rounds of military attacks upon them. We see the resistance forces in both Iraq and Syria striking back on behalf of the Palestinians against U.S. military forces in Syria and Iraq. We see Israel attacking Syria. We have seen Israel repeatedly trying to provoke Lebanon. It's a very dangerous situation. Alexander, your comment on that?
No, I mean, I think that's how you made many of the same points. I mean, I don't think it's World War III, but it's very bad. I mean, you look at the situation in the Middle East, it is clearly escalating, and it is becoming very dangerous. And again, at the heart of it is this problem in Gaza. I mean, we wouldn't have problems in the Red Sea at the moment. We wouldn't have a gathering crisis in Lebanon if there wasn't this disaster, this humanitarian tragedy, this what the ICJ says, a prima facie case of genocide in Gaza.
There is a danger that people should be cognizant of. Things are not going well for Israel, needless to say. They would very much like to get the U.S. involved in an open hostility with Iran. Neocons in Washington are positively lusting after that kind of thing. Fortunately for the world, the Iranians are not rising to the bait. So where does that leave the Israelis? Watch out for a false flag attack, folks. The Israelis, when push comes to shove, will do what they can to blame Iran for whatever kind of casus belli they develop and mousetrap the U.S. and the administration into supporting Israel full bore. If I didn't think there was a 50% chance of that, I wouldn't mention it in this forum. But I do think it's 50%, and I just throw that out for people to be alert for.
Well, Ray, you're correct. Look at the Israeli attack on the Liberty in the 1967 war. They tried to sink the Liberty and then blame it on the Egyptians and get the U.S. involved. And those men courageously fought back. I was, for a period of time, counsel for the Liberty veterans. I regret to say, because of the power of the Zionist lobby here in the United States, I couldn't accomplish anything for them. But it does appear they will go to their graves unvindicated. I'm sorry about that. The Liberty is a perfect case in point of false flag, and you're right. That could happen here. Something along those lines, yes.
Just to add,
Yep.
just to add to that, if I may, the Israelis, as Francis correctly points out, escaped any opprobrium. President Johnson, Secretary McNamara, and the U.S. Navy, to its shame, covered the incident up. 34 sailors killed, 171 wounded. It was only saved when one of those enterprising sailors in the infantry, we call it a field expedient, but he got some baling wire and put together a way to broadcast an SOS out, and that saved that ship from complete sinking. Now, what was the lesson there? Well, it's clear. The lessons learned that the Israelis could literally get away with murder, okay? Not only murdering Palestinians, but murdering American service people. Get away with it, and we would cover it up. Now, have things changed? I dare say they've gotten still worse in that department. Would you agree, Francis?
Yes, and as a matter of fact, I did investigate this for the Liberty veterans. It's been a while, but there is both a constitutional definition of treason and a statutory definition of treason. And in my opinion, certainly Secretary of Defense McNamara committed treason as for what he did there with Liberty. And the Zionists got away with it because of the power of the Zionist lobby here in the United States. And it could happen again. Indeed, we've seen, starting with Reagan, the infiltration of all elements of our government by these diehard neocon Zionists. They're all up and down. They control the Western U.S. News media. They're very powerful. And you can see how, as Craig pointed out, and here in the United States, they are spinning this World Court lawsuit in favor of Israel. So you're correct. It's gotten worse. I wrote a book, I guess it was published in 1989, talking about and analyzing the Israelization of American foreign policy. And it's only accelerated since I wrote that book in 1989. Yes.
Francis, it wasn't put out by Harvard University Press, I don't think.
No, they're all Zionists there, I can tell you that.
One little specific here, for those of you who don't know, McNamara, treason, what did he do? There were 2 aircraft carriers in the Med. They're both within range of doing dueling with Israeli fighter jets bombing and Israeli patrol boats torpedoing the Liberty. What did he do? He called them back. He said, he called Admiral Grace. He said, look, you call us back. And the Admiral, to his credit, said, I'm sorry. My forces are at war. I'm going to have to talk to your supervisor.
Right.
McNamara says, he's right here. LBJ gets on the phone and says, you call right. those planes back? I don't want to give a black eye to our ally Israel.
Right.
And
well,
they did. So,
treason.
yeah,
right.
treason.
Yes, both of them.
Treason? Yes. Yeah, treason.
Right.
I was going to mention this Lavon affair in 1954, named after the defense minister of Israel at the time, where they had a bunch of Israeli operatives in Egypt. We're going to blow up American and British and Egyptian-owned cafes and cinemas and blame it on the Egyptian communists and the Muslim Brotherhood, but it got exposed. So there is a history, and that one was confirmed, of a false flag by Israel. If there's anything else that anyone wants to add, this is the time. Otherwise, we will bid all of you a goodbye, and thank you so much for your time. And Ray has a few words I think he wants to say, because today is January 27th, and it was 6 years ago today that the founder of Consortium News, Robert Parry, died, and we still miss him very much. And Ray, I think you wanted to say a few words about that.
Well, I did. Two things. I look at the faces on the screen and I know they're working like 20 hours a day. That's what Bob did. Now you can say strokes, you can say cancer, but the last things that Bob said to me a couple of days before he died in the hospital was, and he was heavily sedated. He said, "Ray, it's just too much, right? It's just too much. It's too much." It was it was strange. It was eerie. He was telling the truth in a kind of jocular, "It's too much, right? Too much, right?" So I would just caution all of us. And I'm preaching to myself here. Don't do too much, okay? Don't do too much. Last thing I'll say, and this I think is more relevant perhaps to the state of the media these days, is that Bob told this story, which is true, and he allowed me to publish it. When he came down to Newsweek from AP, and he was a hero, he had exposed Iran-Contra, and all of a sudden, after a month, he was invited to a little soiree, okay? Only about 12 people, and corporate was coming down from New York, and they said, "Bob, would you like to come?" I said, "Sure." So there were 12 people there, all men, and there was a congressman from Wyoming there, for God's sake, his name was Cheney, and apropos of nothing, over the shrimp cocktail, General Brent Scowcroft, who had just stopped being the national security advisor, says, "You know, gentlemen, my successor, Admiral Poindexter, is going to Congress on Tuesday. I would advise him to say that we never told Ronald Reagan a thing about Iran and Contra." Now, Bob Parry told me that, unaccustomed as he was to such soirees, he dropped his fork, broke his shrimp cocktail platter, and instinctively said, "General Scowcroft, do you mean you would advise your successor to perjure himself before the Congress?" Dead silence for about a half a minute, according to Bob. And then the Newsweek president or chairman and the muckety-mucky there of Newsweek in Washington said, "No, Bob, Bob, you have to realize that sometimes you have to do what's best for the American people." Then there was this chittering all male little. In other words, Bob learned then and there, they know what's best for the American people. That's what they're going to tell the American people. And in February 2003, Newsweek had the transcript of the UN debriefing of Saddam Hussein's son-in-law, who was in charge of weapons of mass destruction. And the debrief said they were all destroyed, chemical, biological, the nuclear weapons, so such as they were, and the means for delivery. That was given to Newsweek by Scott Ritter, late February 2003. Newsweek put up a little things. "Oh, we have this report from the UN," and then they went up to the agent to CIA, okay, and the others, "What about this? What about this? It's bull. It's crazy. Don't publish on it." And these correspondents said, "Oh, thank you, CIA PR person. We were going to tell that story." This was 1 month before the attack on Iraq. So you got Newsweek is just kind of a prototype of all this stuff. Bob learned that in a most poignant way when he spoke out of turn and saying, General Scowcroft, do you mean you advise your successor to perjure himself before Congress? Bob was a rock. He taught me a lot about journalism. So has Joe. And I'm appreciative for the chance to say these things.
Thank you very, very much, Ray. And thank you, Francis Boyle, for coming in when you did. And Alexander, always a pleasure to have you back here talking about something other than Ukraine. And and Craig Murray, I think this is your first time on our webcast, and I really appreciate you coming on. I hope we see you back again. And let me thank Elizabeth Voss, my co-host, and Kathy Vogan back in Sydney, Australia, who was producing all this at an ungodly hour. So for Consortium News and CNLive, this is Joe Lawyer. I thank again everyone for tuning in to this discussion, and we'll be back on the airs very soon to continue with this and other stories. Goodbye.
Thanks, Joe.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Get out your notebook. There's more.
If you are a consumer of independent news, then the first place you should be going to is Consortium News, and please do try to support them when you can. It doesn't have its articles behind a paywall. It's free for everyone. It's one of the best news sites out there, and it's been in the business of independent journalism and adversarial independent journalism for over 2 decades. I hope that with the public's continuing support of Consortium News, it will continue for a very long time to come. Thank you so much.